Hello, welcome to this talk. My name is Paulina Haustein, and I'm speaking to you today from Basel, Switzerland. In this presentation, we'll be examining the performer-audience impact of reintroducing stylistic, solo, and ensemble improvisation to Western classical concert programs. The program you played was interesting and impressive, but the improvisation at the end was the most exciting. It was these types of comments from concert audiences that eventually led me to this project and to my performance doctorate with David Dolan, John Sloboda, and Adrian Brendel at the Guildhall School in London. After graduating from Sibelius Academy in Helsinki, I moved to Los Angeles for a few years, where I felt far enough from home to start including small improvisations in my recital performances, something I'd always been interested in. Simple as they were, the way audiences responded to these moments appeared different, more emotional than to the rest of the program. I don't know why, but the improvisation at the end made me cry, was a recurring comment that I didn't quite understand. A few years later in Finland, I met David Dolan, and a fire was instantly ignited. Redirecting my professional path, I left my orchestra contract to study classical improvisation in London. To me, the musicianship of master improvisers, such as many of you here, looked like freedom. Freedom to not only repeat, but create text in the styles of classical music, to explore, reflect, and dialogue with the voices of composers, with fellow musicians, and creating a conversation that even includes the audience. This artistic research inquiry was formulated on a trifold motivation: learning and reintroducing stylistic improvisation ability to existing musicianship, adding it to concert programs and performances in a historically inspired way, and observing both performer and audience experience specifically regarding development of emotional and relational engagement and impulse exchange. The project was informed by previous studies indicating a heightened engagement of musicians and audience members during improvised moments versus non-improvised moments. In their complex interdisciplinary studies, Dolan et al. Had concluded that when the improvisatory approach was applied, creative risk-taking increased, together with the level of expressivity, musicality, emotional communication, and ensemble work, according to both the performers and audiences. Neuroimaging data further indicated a time-related synchronization of brainwave activity, suggesting that everyone in the room was in fact experiencing an enhanced emotional experience at the same time, as it was related to improvised moments. Concerts in general during the 18th and 19th centuries, or the golden age of improvisation, were much more interactive than they are today, and audiences could be loud and active participants in the concert event. And most importantly, musicians had skill sets that could incorporate the audience's input into the musical performance. As in my own experiences, creative risk-taking through improvising had enabled a different kind of, more emotional experience among audience members, which led me to question, how could that be intentionally harnessed and expanded upon? Could creative risk-taking be practiced and integrated more systematically to performance? So, what is the improvisatory approach, and what does it mean to apply it? The improvisatory approach is a method that takes into account the wider context of historical performance practice and concert culture surrounding the compositions at the time of their creation, as well as what is known of notation and stylistic extemporization. Applying the improvisatory approach includes a wider context of spontaneity and improvising, including playing unwritten notes and whole pieces, such as preludes or fantasies, in a concert program. The goal is to merge intuition and know-how in order to add the performer's personal voice through improvisatory contributions, and to promote and engage in an authentic spirit of playful creativity. As we are experiencing a historical moment at this first stylistic improvisation conference and starting some very important discussions, I'll briefly share with you the definition formulated for this study. In 20th and 21st century, a common language use of improvisation appears primarily related to playing unwritten notes. In this study, improvising occurs within a Western classical context, acknowledges meanings derived from German verbs fantasieren, preludieren, and extemporieren, and includes a variety of elements from historical performance practice. The following categorization was chosen because it appeared pedagogically the best approach to study improvisation and approaching it through repertoire-related improvisations, independent of repertoire, and in-between formats. This artistic research project looks at the space between the stage and the audience. What is the impact on both sides when improvisatory elements are reintegrated into the concert? The research included 4 action cycles of documented artistic practice, including conducting rehearsals, designing concert programs with improvisatory elements, and reflecting on performances and interactions afterwards. Performer data was collected through reflective diary, video recordings, and measurement of sound parameters. Audience data was collected through questionnaires, a focus group, and semi-structured interviews. Let's start from the stage side, learning to improvise. A pivotal point for me personally was discovering the intertwined spirit of music making and the merging of skills in past centuries. How all musicians were more or less performer, composer, improvisers. You wouldn't just do one of these things, you would be performing written pieces and composing music and improvising in practice and performance. I entered the project as a cellist, orchestral player, and chamber musician with weak background in music theory subjects from my study years, because of my own fault. Having approached music mainly from a single line melody perspective, I now had to dive into compositional structures and full scores and realized in desperation I should have paid much more attention in analysis, harmony, and theory classes. Berkowitz, as well as many others, uses the common metaphor between improvisation and language learning. In my case, I was already familiar with much of the Western classical canon, so emphasis was on reintegrating the improvisatory approach with my pre-learned knowledge. I started relearning repertoire through structural and stylistic lenses to expand my real-time awareness of the grammatic layers of the musical text. The goal was to gain artistic freedom to intentionally play within and without styles. Through techniques like transposition, variation, and automation, according to Berkowitz, improvising musicians can engage in recombination, following the precedents of ars combinatoria or partimento. Eventually, musicians then become able to spontaneously draw on their personal stockpile of all learned music. Now, modern conservatory training includes harmony, theory, and instrument performance, but in my view, a much more integrated understanding is necessary to develop stylistic improvising ability. Or, to continue with a metaphor of language, to learn the underlying grammars of the different styles. As Robert Levin says, the task of inventing within the individual languages of the great composers is daunting, if not impossible, for a performer who has not had extensive training in the grammar, syntax, rhetoric, and texture of music, and indeed of composition itself. When creating strategies for melody and orchestral instruments, I discovered something: intuitive hidden knowledge that became activated in ensemble playing. As a cellist, I noticed a surprising power when playing with a group of orchestral instrumentalists. By providing structural and harmonic leadership, I could lead the creation of a stylistic improvised piece with musicians who, quote unquote, didn't actually know what they were doing or had minimal training in stylistic improvisation. For melody instrumentalists, ensemble playing appeared to activate hidden knowledge that enabled another, more intuitive way to enter stylistic improvisation without having actually engaged in rigorous intellectual study of style, analysis, or harmony. So, what happens when the improvisatory approach was applied to performance? In concert number 3, I invited the audience to witness my learning process of the Romantic style. With the pianist, we created a theme and variations performance of Chopin's Prelude in B minor, opus 28, so that first it's played as written, then a variation with cello improvising and piano playing text, or pianist playing text, and a second variation vice versa, cello playing text and pianist improvising. Using the Sonic Visualizer sound analysis software, I'll now show you the first 4 bars of both the written text performance and the variation where the pianist was free to improvise. So I'm going to explain what's going on here. In the Sonic Visualizer, the vertical lines indicate beat subdivisions, so 3 beats per bar, 1, 2, 3. And in the lower pane, the horizontal axis shows the fluctuation in timing or tempo, which here is the lower thin wave with numbers, and dynamic, which here is the upper thick wave. And here's the score. We can take a quick look. And we're going to first hear and see the as-is version. And next, the second variation. So when the cello was still playing the text and the pianist was free to improvise. So when looking at the two together, the as-is version depicts more inconsistency and individual treatment of beats and bars. Though culmination points of tempo and intensity are identical in both versions, so 2.1 and 3.3 here. The shape of the intensity curve in the variation shows more clearly 2 swells, 1, 2, and the beginning of a third, following the melodic and harmonic structure of the composition. In the variation, performers appear more connected to a deeper sense of pulse and longer-term phrase structure, as well as each other's lines, even when one is richly elaborated on. This is evidenced by arriving together at a more distant goal point, indicating a higher degree of sensitivity or musical mind reading, which becomes activated when one partner doesn't know what the other will do. In the variation, the cello appears to accommodate spontaneously the use of rubato of the pianist, both by giving space and by accelerating to follow the improvised melody. This rubato, which is a distinctive characteristic of Chopin's style, is demonstrated, for example, in the first bar of the variation. First, the cello phrasing aims towards beat 1.2, followed by improvised imitating response of the pianist, aiming towards 1.3, so here. Pushing both tempo and intensity up here with the cello joins, resulting in arriving together at 2.1. So now let's switch our point of view for a moment and go sit in the audience. As mentioned earlier, an 18th or 19th century experience of attending a live concert as an audience member could be quite different than it typically is today. Audiences were accustomed to being asked for themes for improvisations, and they could be loud and active participants throughout the evening. Musicians intentionally used improvising to build relationships with audiences, as the emotional power was well understood. Dana Gooley describes how it impacted the atmosphere. Improvisation opened up a more informal, intimate mode of communication that licensed the audience to approach the stage. He describes Liszt's use of improvisation. Listeners were not asked to passively take in the familiar melodies and brilliant virtuosity, but were encouraged to follow along in his thought process. The improvisations activated a more direct artist-audience bond and suspended the comedy form of music. Now, since the end of the 19th century, the role of audiences has steadily shifted from active to passive, and the image people today have of classical concert culture appears quite different than the illustrated excitement of historical examples. Christopher Small described the problem of passive audiency. While our attention is without doubt active, it is detached. We no longer feel ourselves to be part of the performance, but listen to it as it were from the outside. Now, in this project, audience feedback was gathered in 3 different concerts. The following topics were brought up by respondents in all concerts, regardless of performers, the program, skill levels, or even country where the concert was held. So, confirming the working hypothesis, audience members did report experiencing heightened emotional engagement, alertness, and attentiveness in relation to moments that were improvised, whether or not they knew it was improvised. In all forms of feedback gathering, significant impact was reported regarding the atmosphere in the audience of the concert. Let me quickly show you the first concert questionnaire results that led to probing this aspect further. So here you can see respondents were asked about their expectation of atmosphere at a classical concert before the concert, and then how they experienced the atmosphere at this one afterwards. They did this by marking a spot on a line between these 2 poles of emotions on a questionnaire. So a quite intuitive way of responding. As you can see, significant changes occurred in almost all of the indicators. The atmosphere at this concert was experienced as clearly more excited, supportive, involved, interested, and emotional than they would have expected based on their previous experiences at classical concerts. And this was including those audience members who described themselves as enthusiasts of classical music. Audience members particularly appreciated the performers speaking to the audience and asking them for input, and this was significantly positive for the less experienced concert goers who reported low familiarity with classical music. Audience members enjoyed observing the different personalities of the performers, which resonated with an observation I made in rehearsal stages. Improvising clearly elicited stronger personality projection, both through the performative how it was played and the improvisatory or what was played. Uniqueness of the experience was reflected in that respondents enjoyed the in-the-moment nature of improvising and hearing repertoire and improvisation combined, as well as having a uniquely strong emotional response to the musical performance. Audience members always reflected on the highly engaging fun of following the visual cues and body language related to ensemble improvisation. This appeared to contribute towards an insider co-creative experience. When musicians improvised on audience requests, respondents had felt like they gained access and became an insider to the creativity, watching and listening, the real-time problem solving through both musical and visual cues. And finally, when juxtaposing the data, a correlation between the performer's experience of risk-taking and the audience's experience of highest point of engagement in concert programs was discovered, which was in line with the neuroimaging data from Dolan's studies. So, summary of findings from the project. Acquiring skills. As a musician, wanting to apply the improvisatory approach led to adapting a reintegrated concept of musicianship, inspired by the historical precedents of performing, composing, improvising, in which the performer builds and draws on skills that have been, in recent decades, categorized more separately in conservatory curriculums, if included at all. Audiences enjoyed musicians adding the improvisatory approach to the program, as it appeared to facilitate a more personal connection to the performers, as well as inclusivity and accessibility to the musical experience. This impact appeared, again, particularly meaningful for seldom concert goers who had little familiarity with classical music. However, in all forms of feedback, respondents across the board had felt more emotionally engaged than they had expected to at a classical concert. Examining data of interactions revealed that impulse exchange between musicians and audience occurred throughout the concert and appeared to develop upon each other, resulting in a shared emotional and even relational experience. something probably all improvising performers can describe in some way. As a musician, learning through repeated audience feedback that risk-taking in improvisation was received positively even when the attempt failed enabled the development of a more stress-free, relaxed, creative, and engaged stage persona. Further artistic outcomes of the project included a positive impact of improvising on instrument technique, musicianship, and musical literacy, negotiating the performance psychology of risk-taking, developing a more stress-free performative persona, and becoming empowered by the audience, and having a higher mind-reading goal for all chamber music and ensemble playing activities. According to previous studies, the main goal or main motivation for audiences coming to a concert is to become engaged, but this engagement does not happen by itself. If the listeners have little to no pre-existing relationship with the usually dead composers or repertoire pieces, their desire to connect falls on the specific performers. Engaging audiences is a challenge that every performing arts institution faces today, something which may even be described as a crisis of audiency in the wake after the pandemic. In the concert model emerging from this study, aspects of both past and present audiencing experience were considered and integrated. The concert was presented as an invitation to engage in reflective conversation with the voices of the composers, performers, and even fellow audience members. The research identified features of ensemble improvisation, such as empathy, emergence, mutual engagement, and collaborative creativity, that became mirrored in audiences' responses. They described feeling like active participants in a creative collaborative exchange, and thus becoming stakeholders in a deeper phenomenon of meaning making and narrativization. Christopher Small, who yearned for a more connected audiencing experience, formulated that a performance creates relationships between participants as an embodiment of relationships created between sounds. The approach explored in this concert model could be viewed as an extension of his idea, deliberately making the relation between human and musical connection explicit, pursuing emotional messaging in musical performance, and directing the aesthetic of the event towards human representations. Thank you very much for your attention, and I am very happy to take your questions.